Up next, Bragan Paramanantham from AECOM is here to pull back the curtain on where construction's innovation dollars should be going and what contractors actually need. If you're curious about the future of Contech, you're in the right place. Please welcome Bragan.
Thanks for the introduction, Nicholas. So my presentation is about what contractors want versus what VCs fund. So really trying to understand some of construction's innovation gaps between where we're seeing early stage funding going to and what contractors or big construction firms are saying about, hey, this is what we actually want in the industry. And this conversation actually came about from just, chatting to someone in the industry who mentioned, how do we actually know that where early stage funding is going in terms of where VCs are putting the money? Is that actually where we actually want to see kind of new innovation cropping up? And by analyzing this, can we actually take a bit of the guesswork out and go, hey, this is where innovation is going to occur in the future, and this is where we should invest, or this is an overlooked opportunity for new startups to actually start building. And I'll dive into the methodology in a moment so that it's just really clear to you what I mean by these terms. Now, before I kick it off into that, I'll just do a quick about me. So I'm a civil engineer over at AECOM. So I've worked in the pavements and the aviation team. And I guess like our team's kind of call to fame is we were featured, or one of our projects was featured in an Aaron Witt video. So it was one of the slab replacement projects down at Melbourne Airport. So you work all night and try and replace a concrete slab before the works open again in the morning. After that, I actually worked in an innovation role, so in AI training and capability uplift. So how do we actually get our people go from 0 to 1 of, hey, we don't know what ChatGPT is, to, hey, let's start to use ChatGPT in a safe and secure way. So we ran these workshops throughout the organization. And then I also write a newsletter called Last Week in Context. So basically what we're looking at is some of the startup funding information in terms of the construction sector, and just trying to understand where innovation is occurring and how we as an industry can adopt new solutions so that we can actually improve the way that we do our work and hopefully kind of improve outcomes across the industry as well. And then finally, right now, I'm actually on sabbatical. So I've taken 12 months of time off, and I'm working kind of fractionally as the head of content at Formwork Labs, which is an early stage construction accelerator program backed by Brick and Mortar Ventures. And, if you're an early stage startup looking to build for our industry, that's something we're really interested in supporting. Now, diving a bit more into the presentation itself, what I want to outline is kind of the methodology and the research that we did to understand, what the construction firms actually want, and then on the other side, how or where the funding is actually going. So what we did is we created a list of publicly listed global firms. So we had about 16 firms, from GCs to engineering consultants, material suppliers, and some of the big tech companies. And what we did is we looked at their quarterly earnings presentations and their quarterly earnings transcripts. So by reading through this information, what we can understand is, where the construction sector is going over the last 3 months, but also during the conference calls transcripts and their quarterly earnings transcripts, analysts ask them questions around technology adoption and AI adoption. And by analyzing that information, we can see, hey, there's new opportunities for solutions, or there's new opportunities for startups to start actually building for the industry. Something I do want to note is that we are focused on the bigger end of town. So these are very much publicly listed global firms. So there is a bit more of a bent towards the infrastructure sector and major government as clients versus, the residential or commercial sector at the moment. On the other side, we wanted to understand the startup funding data. So every week, as part of Last Week in Contact, I categorize the startup funding information. So we look at all the startups that gain funding in kind of the AEC tech or the construction tech sector, and I'll go into the definition a bit later in the presentation. And then we categorize that information. And what we're able to do is create this massive table and then know and understand where investment dollars are actually going. And by doing both of these activities together, we can understand, hey, is there a relationship between where the construction firms and the construction industry says, hey, we need solutions, or this is where the industry is going. And hey, this is actually where the new technology solutions that are being funded today, but will hit commercialization in the next 3 to 5 years, or hit scale in that time frame, actually being built for that industry. So we can start to map a relationship between those two. So let's kick it off. I wanted to first start with where construction firms see opportunity. And before we go into the tech and the AI and their conversation around that, I wanted to highlight some of the macroeconomic trends that they've mentioned in terms of where the construction sector is going kind of globally, and then specific growing verticals within that as well. So the first thing that we saw was some global macroeconomic trends that these firms were mentioning that were affecting their backlogs and kind of tailwinds for where they see opportunity. The first thing that was mentioned quite consistently was this rising amount of geopolitical and legislation risk. So as we move from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, there's a lot more in terms of tariffs and how that's affecting kind of supply chains and material costs. And kind of that competition with China. So there was a lot of interest around procurement and really being consistent in terms of material costs. So I think that's something that was a really interesting trend to see also in the startup funding data. The next one is there was a lot of election uncertainty over the last 18 to 24 months. So Western markets, or kind of a number of Western markets had elections. And what that means is as a new government comes in, there's a bit of a pause in new infrastructure projects being awarded as they're kind of figuring out their policy. And then now that's picking up with the UK announcing a really big infrastructure package, and Canada last week also, or at the start of November, announcing a really big infrastructure package as well. And then finally, we saw this kind of consistent messaging across the board of there's a growing infrastructure need. And there's this growing amount of kind of backlog interest where there's aging infrastructure across Western markets. There's this demand for data centers, and the consultants especially are seeing a lot of growth in early stage design of new data center complexes. Energy security and renewable energy generation is becoming of interest, especially due to the Russia-Ukraine war, water and wastewater treatment due to population growth, and then reshoring of the industrial manufacturing supply chain in the US is another kind of growing construction vertical. So understanding these macroeconomic trends just help us to understand, where the market is going and what kind of specific sectors are looking for kind of opportunities and solutions. So that could be like the water sector, for example. Now, diving into it in a little bit more detail as well, in terms of just growing construction sectors, as I mentioned, data centers is really growing as a vertical. And it's quite interesting because it isn't just design of a data center, it's also greenfield and brownfield development. So all the associated infrastructure, things like water and electricity infrastructure, there's a lot of work in this sector right now, and it's easily the fastest growing backlog for these firms. The next one was energy and transmission. So energy generation and renewable energy generation is going cheaper, but the transmission infrastructure is a big kind of supply chain bottleneck. So there's a massive weight on grid transformers, but at the same time, there's permitting issues with creating new transmission infrastructure. So even though you're building new kind of power plants, you aren't able to connect them to the grid. So there's a lot of work and an opportunity in that sector, especially even considering some of the permitting considerations around that. And then finally, defense spending was increasing. So obviously there's hard military spending, but there's also a lot of kind of ports spending, airfield spending, associated road infrastructure spending. So there's a lot of associated infrastructure spending with defense. And for the bigger end of town, they're seeing that as an opportunity for a future growth tailwind. And before now we just jump into the tech and AI section of this, I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the US market outlook, because I know that's of interest to a number of people. And something that kind of came up in terms of like growing opportunities is what we already mentioned before. But what was really interesting is that only 36% of the Infrastructure Act's funding, so that big Infrastructure Act under the Biden administration, has actually only been spent. So there's still a lot of money that's obligated, and there's still a large amount of opportunity for infrastructure spend in the US, but it does depend on whether the Trump administration tries to claw back some of that funding. And then finally, we also saw that state Department of Transport budgets are hitting a record high. So increasing 6% again this year. So that just means there's a lot more opportunity kind of in that road infrastructure segment than I personally, before this presentation and research, actually noticed or realized. So there's still a lot of growing opportunity in the US. Something that did come up and I thought was quite interesting is there still is uncertainty in the market, and what firms are seeing is, hey, their backlogs are still growing, or their backlogs are looking really healthy, but what they're seeing is longer kind of kickoff times for projects. So projects aren't kicking off, as expected. They might be delayed due to supply chain and tariff impacts. So that's just something to bear in mind if you are selling to this sector. Now, diving a bit more deeper into what they were saying about technology is, across the board, AI adoption is becoming kind of a real thing, and we're seeing deployment throughout organizations. So the first interesting opportunity that was mentioned is on the consultant side. So engineering consultants were mentioning they were looking at using AI to increase their win rates. So how do we use it to improve bids and proposal workflows? And I think it was Stantec or WSP, one of them was saying that, hey, actually 80% of human output can be reduced by using AI in bids and proposals, because the teams are duplicated across regional and business line functions. So there's a big opportunity there. We also saw that AI co-pilots are actually being actively deployed throughout organizations. So Turner Construction announced a really big partnership with OpenAI to roll out ChatGPT at an enterprise level across their workforce. And then Stantec has deployed 10,000 Microsoft Copilot licenses across their workforce out of the 33,000 people that they have. And then Trimble, which is a construction tech giant, mentioned that they're actually deploying AI workforce training. So they want everyone to be AI ready and AI capable across their workforce. So AI has moved from, hey, this is the future, to, hey, we are actively deploying it within our organizations. We also saw mention of an interest in generative design solutions in the consultants side. So they're seeing AI as an opportunity for that early stage preliminary or feasibility design. And then at a later stage, that keeps a bit more of the budget to do a bit more of the detailed design. So they haven't seen solutions there, but they're seeing that as an opportunity to use AI. And then finally, something that was really interesting is WSP is actually delivering AI solutions for their end market. So they're doing a lot of solutions around AI and sensors. So real-time monitoring of landslide risk, real-time monitoring of climate risk for their clients. So there's definitely some kind of opportunity in a hardware plus a software componentry to do some of this real-time monitoring with AI. So if you can productize that in some way, that's quite an interesting place by reading some of WSP's opportunities there. Now, shifting a little bit of gears to some of those big vendors selling AI, I just wanted to call this out because by understanding their information, we can see what kind of feature set they think the industry also needs. And what we saw was Procore, acquired some BIM capabilities, but then across the board, we're seeing kind of AI agents for workflow automation. So where we've been talking about the deployment of co-pilots or chatbots as kind of the first instance of AI. Now we're seeing the deployment of AI agents. So how do we actually look at a workflow and use AI to kind of automate it end to end, or just have small instances of humans jumping in the loop and providing approvals? And if you've also kind of followed along with Kahua's track, Kahua's deploying a lot of AI capabilities kind of in this same mindset. So we're seeing it across the board where vendors who are selling to the industry are looking at, hey, how can we actually use AI? How can we use AI from an agentic perspective to really streamline kind of workflow automation and processes? And then finally, Autodesk also mentioned something really interesting, which they saw kind of a growing opportunity in the industrialized construction segment. So I think that's quite an interesting call out, because we are seeing a lot of startups kind of building within that segment, or even in kind of that modular segment. So and offsite construction. So that was quite an interesting kind of overview of the opportunities that the construction giants are seeing, and specifically where vendors are actually building AI capabilities. So now that we understand and have this broad understanding of where the market's going and what the market's really kind of wanting and expecting, let's actually see if that maps to the VC funding amount. So at a high level, I analyzed all the data and we saw there was about $5.6 billion of funding in the first 9 months of 2025. And that was about 322 announced funding rounds, with 40 of them having undisclosed kind of amounts of specific funding. But before we go on, I do want to kind of make this call out of what is construction, because a lot of people have different definitions of what construction tech is. And by my definition, I'm quite broad as to how I say this is a construction tech solution. So we just say that a construction tech startup is anything startup that's developing technology impacting our value chain. So from land development to engineering and construction, or even covering things like retrofitting, infrastructure and building operations, or end-of-life processes like recycling. So just bear that in mind as you see some of the funding numbers I'm about to show you. So what we now have is a table which has a top funded category. And the first and the kind of best funded category is actually green materials. So I find that as a little bit of a surprise just looking at what contractors and construction firms were saying. And I think this kind of funding amount is really kind of pushed forward by a lot of the legislative changes in the EU, which has really strong kind of considerations around building emissions and embodied carbon. And, you know, green cement is a really big part of how we reduce carbon emissions. Now, with this invested amount of 524 million, actually 300 million is associated to two specific deals of Terrabase and Brimstone. So they're both building out factories to produce their own new green material. So when you kind of normalize for that amount of funding, it is actually, it probably isn't kind of the top funded category. Well, it is, but it isn't in terms of, hey, the 30 deals, it's only really 2 deals making up a large amount of that factory capex that they need. The highest funding categories next is actually AI, which I think comes as no surprise to people. I do want to note that I've only counted 9 deals in the AI category, and that's specifically because I used AI as, hey, this is a startup that's building something completely new with AI, like Trunk Tools, who's trying to build an AI brain for construction. When you actually analyze who's using the term AI within their kind of startup description, there's about 60 or 70 startups who are saying, hey, we're an AI-powered platform for procurement. We're an AI-powered platform for business management. But those startups were defined by what actual value and use case they provide to the industry, not by the technology that they're using underlying to deliver that particular use case. But yes, AI is probably one of the highest growing categories, and we'll dive into that in a bit more detail in a moment. The next one was procurement, and that was really interesting to me. So if you look at the data, there's a lot of investment in materials marketplace. So kind of your Amazon or B2B kind of style marketplace for materials procurement, associated with some financing as well. So how do you get some kind of buy now, pay later system for actually getting materials on site? These materials marketplaces often also do logistics. And I think that's a reflection of that macroeconomic trend we saw at the start, where tariffs and supply chains are being really disrupted. So any kind of solution which improves on that is really valuable. Now, diving a bit more deeper into AI investment, we saw quite a bit of investment in AI co-pilots. I think that's quite interesting because, as we mentioned, we're seeing co-pilots being actively deployed. So again, the industry is going, hey, we want to actually use co-pilot services, and venture capital investors are funding those as well. We also saw, which isn't called out specifically here, a lot of generative design solutions which were AI co-pilots, so like an AI co-pilot for structural design. So there's a lot of interesting co-pilot solutions right now. We also see AI agent startups getting a lot of funding. So again, going back to that point of, vendors selling AI, they're building AI agent workflows, and calling out to what Kahua is doing with the new AI developments and their feature updates. There's a lot of interest in this AI agent space. And then finally, we saw a massive round field AI as well. So building out physical AI and robotics, so the foundation model which can power robotics, that's a great category of interest for the industry as well. Now, diving into a bit more detail on the most number of deals in a particular category, we see green materials and procurement, but we also saw robotics. So we have 16 deals with an invested amount of 122 million. So that's a little bit kind of smaller in terms of the average deal size. So the average deal size is less than 10 million. So I think that's a reflection of, robotics as a category is kind of earlier stage in terms of technology readiness level. So you're seeing pre-seed, seed, Series A rounds. So I think that's why when we looked at the earning calls transcripts, we didn't see any mentions about robotics, because robotics is of interest for venture capital firms as, hey, this is the next growing category. But right now, it isn't going to be actively deployed probably in the next, 12 months. We're probably going to see kind of deployment in the next 3 to 5 years because they're so early stage in terms of being seed or Series A level. But there's a real growing opportunity in robotics deployment. We also see kind of the fifth one there of design. So as we mentioned before, the engineering consultants mentioned that design is of increasing interest to our industry. So how can we actually use generative design solutions? So I think it makes a lot of sense. We're seeing a lot of investment kind of again in that early stage of seed, Series A, of early stage design solutions. And there's a lot more interest there. And a lot of these solutions are kind of like your AI co-pilot for design. So now that we kind of have a bit of an overview of where contractors are actually seeing opportunity both in the market and in terms of technology, and then also understanding where startup funding is actually going, some key final takeaways that I took away from this research was, number one, kind of that infrastructure and road project backlog is continuing to grow in the US. I think with the turn of the new administration, I wasn't aware of where the funding in terms of government infrastructure projects was sitting. So it's quite interesting to see that is kind of growing at least at a state Department of Transport level and some of the Infrastructure Act funding that's still available. We also saw that engineering consultants are really actively deploying AI to increase margin. Across the board, analysts are consistently asking them, how are you using AI? How are you using technology? How are you deploying it across the organization? We saw specifically that co-pilots are growing in adoption. So Turner Construction, Stantec actively deploying that. But then AI agents and robotics are the next category of interest. So if you are a startup building out those like agentic capabilities, that is something that to compete in the future is likely going to be hitting the market soon, and something that you do need to be capable of, or at least be able to speak to. And then finally, there's this growing interest in design-related solutions. So I think previously we probably haven't seen that kind of disruption in the way design is done. But right now, there's a lot of interest in AI co-pilots for design or just generative design solutions, both from the market and those earning calls transcripts, but also where funding is going. So I think that'll be really interesting to see how design is kind of rethought, especially considering that a lot of these engineering consultants work on billable hour models. So how will generative design solutions kind of clash or support billable hour models? But that's the kind of end of the presentation. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to that, and we'll open it for Q&A in a moment.
Well done, everyone. Thanks so much, Ragan. That was fantastic. We're going to go straight to Q&A if you're ready for that.
Right.
All right. Our first question comes in and asks, do you think the number of deals for AI as a top funded category will increase?
Yes, I do. Like I will mention, I think I mentioned already, is I've been very specific about how I categorized AI. But if you look at startups that are saying, hey, we're AI powered in some way, like I think almost 25% were saying they're AI powered in some way. But we're seeing more and more interest, not only on AI copilots, but AI-based workflow tools and AI agentic software. I think VCs or like venture capitalists from still talking to them, what they're trying to figure out is what are the metrics that show, one, you're growing very quickly, but defensibility, because AI is moving so rapidly, we don't actually know what makes a very defensible product in some cases, because it's like, hey, when there's a new technology shift, can someone copy what you're building? what's really your moat that anchors you into that company and makes that switching cost a lot more higher or a lot more challenging to go to the next competitor.
Great answer. And your answer and that question itself really tee up the next question very well. You mentioned that AI adoption is growing. What do you think are the most important things we can do to be ready, to be AI ready, and take advantage of these opportunities as this market grows and fleshes itself out?
Yeah, I think on the industry side, what we're consistently seeing and hearing is that while we have more AI solutions, we do have kind of a dearth of AI literacy. So in terms of an education perspective, having people understanding how to prompt, how to use copilots, but also how to validate an AI output, like it makes things up. And you need to be really understanding of, one, it's made a mistake, and then two, how do you roll back that mistake? How do you make a new prompt to fix what it's done and then get the correct result? So it is really important to invest in AI education. And I think right now, we don't have any centralized source for AI education. And even within companies, even power user community groups, just getting the people who are interested in AI and allowing them and supporting them to teach their own teams is becoming more and more important.
Okay, to my favorite question, and I've proposed for the last couple of years that one of the best things we can do is to get our data right. The value of AI is parallel to the value of your data, or the quality of your data, perhaps we should say. So I've suggested that this is the time, as companies are beginning their investment in AI, it is absolutely the time to invest heavily in getting their data cleaned up, to getting their data more accurate. Are there any tips that you would offer to construction organizations on how they can improve the quality of the data that they already own?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's quite challenging, I think, to answer from the perspective of there's so many different data sources, and then validating the input of the data, but then also tagging that data correctly. I think what we've started to see is a growing interest in kind of data warehouse solutions. So getting your data from different point solution providers and putting it into one place, but also tagging it with the relationship in the context. Because you can have the end data, but you need to know where that data came and why it's important or how it relates to everything else. So you're seeing startups like Crew or Projection kind of do that and making construction companies more data ready or more AI ready, because you do need that foundational layer of, one, quality, but then two, the relationship and where the data is coming from to be AI ready. And I think that's more and more important, and people are thinking about it, because otherwise you will get left behind when you start to try and adopt AI solutions.
Going forward, AI should help us improve quality of data by auto capturing, the things that Kahoo and a lot of other companies are doing to automatically capture, for example, nameplate data on an asset during construction. How hard is it for a job site superintendent or a foreman or a electrical worker to type in 42 character serial number with their construction gloves on, right? So if we can use AI tools to automate that process, that improves the quality of our data capture. We also contend that, and I hear this at shows all the time, and we're guilty of it. Too many software companies are guilty of talking about the single source of truth, which for years I've hit the BS button. There's not a single source of truth. We're not one. We don't pretend to be one, because we're not your back office ERP, and we're not your HR tool, and you're not going to use a project management tool to do pure finance and accounting, right? Those have to be their own sources of truth. But the data quality gets improved if we can have those systems talk to each other. So the more integration we can do, the better off we are. There are some silos of data that we want to knock off. We want to knock out point solutions. While they might be best in breed, it does give a consideration of there's another place where I'm putting data. So we want to weigh the value. Can we replace point solutions? And can we do integrations when we can't? Does that seem like a reasonable approach, a good approach that you would offer to owners and constructors?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think integrations are really important. And going back to your point is there isn't one system of record. You have data in so many different places. And that's where the idea of an intermediary data layer or a data warehouse becomes important, because you can put all the data from where it's coming and tag that correctly. And then with AI, you have something called like an MCP server. So that gives you the opportunity to start building applications and query your data in an AI way. So not through a fixed integration or a fixed API, but actually contextually writing these open-ended prompts.
All right, super. Well, we've got more questions, but we've run out of time. So let me thank you once again. I'll encourage our audience to go to the next session. You'll have a choice one more time, and then we'll finish with a plenary with Dr. Basu. Thanks again for being part of this. It was great. We will forward these questions and ask if you can help us reply to those in the post meeting.
Definitely can do. Thank you for having me.